In the wake of that, our Creator God, open our eyes to what it is that we are and were created to be. Amen. Anthony Doerr, Pulitzer Prize-winning author of the novel All the Light We Cannot See, has a new novel. Came out Tuesday, maybe you know. Cloud Cuckoo Land. I haven't read it, but I am so intrigued by what I've read about it. The book has 5 distinct plot lines, and in one of them, a character named Constance, who's only 13, is living in the 22nd century on a spaceship named the Argus. What is notable is that she was born on it, and she will die on it before it gets to the planet where it's going, millions and millions and millions of miles away in space, Earth being no longer habitable. She's part of a bridge generation meant to bear progeny who will populate a world unseen. So imagine knowing that you will not see the place your parents left, nor the place your children will populate. Think about it this way. We may not have been born, you and me, on a spacecraft built by humans, but who is to say a planet isn't in some manner a spacecraft, right? And consider this too. In a sense, all of us are bridge people. Some of us are more bridgy than others, I suppose. Think of the short life of Abraham Lincoln's mother, for example. The bridge nature of one biblical hero is made a lot of in the book of Exodus. I'm thinking of Moses. Moses was not born in the land that the original Abraham was summoned to by God. He was born when his people were in bondage and exile in Egypt. And he is the bridge his people need in order to get home. He will die on the way to the promised land, in fact. But near the end, when his liberating purpose has been accomplished, God takes him up a mountaintop so he can look over and see the promised land. It's a mercy of sorts, his being taken up to see it, but it is a cruel mercy at best. Martin Luther King Jr., on the last night he had a mouth to speak with, spoke to a church full of people in Memphis, Tennessee, identifying himself with Moses' end. "I may not get there with you," he said, "but I have looked over and I have seen the promised land." Now, if you haven't done this already, imagine that you are a bridge person yourself. That your life may not be the most important one in your family line, or that in some special way you are a vehicle meant to bring something special into the world that you will not realize yourself. Consider that your children, or maybe your grandchildren, have a role to play to benefit your family or your nation or the planet or something else in a way that might make you feel you are just the bridge from which he or she was meant to emerge. So hold that thought. Now to this morning's text. This is one of the many psalms of lament in the Bible. It may be the most compelling of all of them, though. It's not hard to read it and see oneself as in a mirror. Here it is as it opens again. "Truly God is good to the upright, to those who are pure in heart." That's a conventional kind of statement about a conventional kind of belief, is it not? The way to have a good, prosperous life, says the psalmist, is to obey the commandments. But right away in verse 2, there is a turn. But as for me, my feet had almost stumbled, my steps had nearly slipped, for I was envious of the arrogant. I saw the prosperity of the wicked, for they have no pain. Their bodies are sound and sleek. They are not in trouble as others are. They are not plagued like other people. The writer is saying, hey, I almost gave up. I was brought up to believe that God prefers the righteous, but like a teenager, I am now thinking I am smarter than my parents. And I am seeing holes in all their ethical assurances. I can't help but notice that people who don't go to church and who spend their Sunday mornings doing devious things instead wind up on the top of the heap. They cheat on tests and get into Yale University. They get insider stock They get insider stock tips. I can't say that. Stock tips. While lounging on a beach in Florida in January. They get plastic surgery beginning in their 30s. They are cynical about religion. This is all in the text. They are highly irreverent. And look, people treat them like celebrities. These people scoff. They say, you don't believe in God, do you? There's no God in heaven. That is just primitive piety. You need to outgrow that. People with money don't need religion. It's for the weak. The poor psalmist, she thinks to herself, these people are always at ease, and their portfolio just keeps growing. I am tortured about this day and night. She feels she was misled and is now tempted to forget God and worship the elite who look to her as sleek as jaguars, who don't get anything because she says you don't get anything for keeping your hands clean. That seems to be the case. But then she catches herself. If I had said, I will talk on in this way, I would have been untrue to the circle of your children. Now, what in the world does that mean? Well, here's what I think she's saying. She's saying, I think, if I continue to think this way, being seduced by the success of others, it would be a betrayal of my grandchildren, and maybe everyone's grandchildren. I don't want them to think of me someday as a sellout to the rich and godless. Being tempted to give up on my ethics in order to make a lot of money or to gain a powerful position makes me kind of sick, especially when I consider what they might come to think of me, these grandchildren of mine. After all, I may well be God's bridge meant to bring them into the world. And if that's the case, maybe I ought to act like I am worthy of that fact. So as a result of these second thoughts, the psalmist says, when I thought how to understand my doubts about God versus my worries about my grandchildren, it seemed to me to be a wearisome task until I went to church, until I spent some time in the presence of the eternal. Now, the speaker doesn't say how practicing her faith changed her mind. Maybe she had an experience with the music, like we just had moments ago, or something else mystical kind of happened to her, or a reading of the Torah touched her, or maybe she had an experience like the prophet Isaiah had when inside God's temple he had a vision of the holy God and it shook him to his core. Whatever happened, the psalmist was jerked out of her envy, and it was as if she had a moment of coming to herself. Like the prodigal son had in Jesus' famous parable, maybe she remembered right then who she was. At that point, having come to herself, she says something to this effect. Then I perceived the fate of these cynical, prosperous people. And what I figured out is they have no staying power. They live in very slippery places and are bound for ruin. She's saying that the market value of what they own could collapse at any moment. Besides, having so much just gives them serial nightmares. They wake up, and in less than a minute, they can't remember what the nightmare was, but it leaves them in a cold sweat. That's in the text too. Now, let me ask you, how true is this? I mean, how slippery are the places the rich and powerful have lodged themselves? I mean, look, their money is exactly what they need to hire the teams of attorneys that they require to keep them out of jail, right? While your thoughts might run to a particular former office holder, I should say, who is in fact losing case after case meant to keep his nefarious deeds secret and himself out of prison, consider Senator Joseph McCarthy, who pulled one over on the American people in a big way back in the 1950s. Nearly everyone was terrified of him, and he reveled in his power for 4 years, 4 long years. Every day, it seemed, he fingered someone new in business or government or the entertainment industry, saying without evidence that he or she was a communist or a pinko, and that person ended up ruined or blacklisted, remember, as a result of the senator's mere accusation. But gradually, a critical mass of people discovered that the emperor had no clothes. But for the longest time, as the historian John Meacham tells us, 34% of Americans believed every word he said. 1/3 of the country, even toward the end. Now, as I said, eventually his daily lying caught up with him. But still, it took all those years for enough people to realize they were being played and to admit it, to themselves at least. It has been said, the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. That's a statement of immense hope, audacious hope. And yet there's no shame in admitting that sometimes, you and I, we just grow weary with so many of our fellow countrymen being okay with being lied to. We grow weary of the accumulation of the immense damage that's being wrought along the way. But remember Senator McCarthy's legacy. He died miserably, not long after he was discredited on the floor of the Senate. He was only in his 40s. If he were alive today and you asked him how he felt about his legacy, I bet he would tell you he might wish to have never been born. Because McCarthyism is the dirtiest word in American political parlance. Little, if anything, touches it. The arc of history is long, but stay tuned. The psalmist continues, "So when I reflected on all that, I had a sour feeling about what almost happened to me. I was stupid to doubt the goodness of God, for being willing even for a moment to envy the rich and powerful. I was a brute beast toward you, God," the psalmist says. But the Bible interpreter Walter Brueggemann says, a closer translation is, "I was a dumbass." At verse 23, the psalmist has an epiphany. It's a statement of renewal of her faith. She realizes the following. She says, "I am continually with you, God. You hold my right hand." Now note, it's not her holding God's hand, but the opposite, that God has been holding her hand the entire time. Think of that. I read recently of a Lutheran aid worker in Africa who had walked hundreds of miles holding the tiny hand of a little girl to get her out of a war zone and into a place where there was peace and safety. She made a point of holding the little girl's hand the whole way, and she said that when they got to the haven that they'd been heading for that whole week, the little girl's hand was a bloody mess. But they hadn't stopped holding hands. That's the kind of desperate hand-holding the psalmist is speaking about. Who do I have in heaven but you, O God? The psalmist concludes. Her temptation to give God up now tastes like ashes in her mouth. Now at the end, she has no desire for anything but the transcendent. And this is important because the people she'd envied were full of desire, unquenchable desire. Because you see, they have all this stuff, but they can't fully enjoy it because they are driven every day by the desire to have just a little bit more. A few weeks ago, I mentioned the result of a study that determined that the amount of money one needs to be happy is something like, remember, $75,000 a year. Now, I suppose it depends a lot on the cost of living of the city where you live, but speaking in average terms, $75,000 is all you need. Anything you make beyond that, said the study, will not increase your happiness. In fact, anything over that might just increase the level of your anxiety and desire that keeps you from even liking what you have. In such a world, desire for more produces a kind of sickness. It makes the greedy person impossible to live with and in some cases strangely unfulfilled. It makes one wonder about the billionaires out there who continue to pressure their congressmen and women to pass further tax cuts so that they can have even more, which, if you think about it for even a moment, you cannot help but see is nothing short of pathological. This is the kind of man Jesus had in mind when he told his parable of the guy who pulled down his barns to build bigger ones. He was exposed by Jesus as not being rich toward God, only rich toward himself. And Jesus is also remembered to have said, "Do not be anxious, for can you add anything to your life, even a nanosecond of time? For even Solomon, with all his vast wealth and power, was not as well off as the birds when it comes to beauty and the joy of merely being alive." The one who created you, he said, knows what you really need. And it doesn't amount to all that much. Okay, you've heard all this before. But I doubt you've heard it put quite the way I'm going to put it here at the end of this sermon. But here's an extract from a commencement speech that the notable genius, the late David Foster Wallace, gave at Kenyon College in 2005. David Foster Wallace was, in fact, a very secular man. So when he spoke disparagingly of atheism, and in favor of the value of religious worship, in this particular speech on that particular campus, at such, as I say, a secular institution as Kenyon, a school for some of the best and the brightest in our land, is kind of stunning. It's a perfect commentary on the psalm we've just been examining. But let me give you just a piece of it here. He says, "In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there's actually no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. And the compelling reason for maybe choosing some sort of God or spiritual type to worship, be it Jesus or Allah, be it Yahweh or the Wiccan Mother Goddess or the Four Noble Truths or some inviolable set of ethical principles, is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive." That's where Vicky stopped. It goes on. If you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough. Never feel you have enough. It's the truth. Worship your own body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths before they finally plant you. On one level, we all know this stuff already. It's been codified as myths, proverbs, cliches, epigrams, parables, the skeleton of every great story. The whole trick is keeping the truth up front in daily consciousness, though. Worship power, you will end up feeling weak and afraid, and you will need ever more power over others to numb you to your own fear. Worship your intellect, being seen as smart, you will end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out. But the insidious thing about these forms of worship is not that they're evil or sinful, it's that they're unconscious. They are default settings. They're the kind of worship you just gradually slip into, just like the writer of today's psalm, right? I'm still reading from David Foster Wallace here. Day after day, getting more and more selective about what you see and how you measure value without ever being fully aware that that's what you're doing. And the so-called real world will not discourage you from operating on your default settings. Because the so-called real world of men and money and power hums merrily along on the fuel of fear and anger and frustration and craving and worship of self. I know that this stuff probably doesn't sound fun and breezy or grandly inspirational the way a commencement speech is supposed to sound, he says. What it is, as far as I can see, is the capital T truth, and a whole lot of rhetorical niceties stripped away from it. You are, of course, free to think of whatever you wish, but please don't just dismiss it as some finger-wagging Dr. Laura sermon. None of this stuff is really about morality or religion or dogma or big fancy questions of life after death. The capital T truth is about life before death. It's about what we worship without even knowing it on this side of dying, in this culture, bent on seducing us with what we don't need at every turn. Amen. Now we'll hear the choir sing most wonderful hymn in our hymn book, For My Money, For Everyone Born.